the movie Free Solo, which came out a couple months ago, and it's about a climber who decides that he is going to climb up 3,500 feet of sheer rock with no ropes. That's pretty scary. You know, it was also pretty scary thinking about that drama just a second ago, and just even leaning backwards and trusting. That's what we're going to get to talk a little bit more about this morning. But before we get there, I want to introduce myself a little bit. Kevin already said who I was, but I was the worship pastor here at this campus for about 7 years before I went to be the Hampstead campus pastor. And so it's really, really fun for me to be back here and be on this stage and engaging with. I've got to see a lot of you that I remembered from years ago. And so thanks for being welcoming of me this morning. And I see a lot of you who I've never met before. And so the same thing for you. Thanks for being welcoming of me this morning. Thanks, Kevin, for letting me come to this campus and sharing a little bit, and Tori too. Quick story about Tori. This is like lesser known thing, is that her wedding anniversary was yesterday and the day before that. So Tori actually celebrates 2 wedding anniversaries every year, because I officiated her wedding right here in this sanctuary, and it was on March the 29th, but I didn't have my wits about me when I was filling out her marriage license, and so I wrote on the marriage license March the 30th. So her real anniversary date is March 29th, but technically it's March the 30th. Which, if you know anything about Tori, and she loves life and she's real excited, she actually likes that. She gets to have 2 different anniversaries back to back. That's good for her. But I do need to apologize to her husband, Nick, so I'm sorry about that. When you saw him in that video, 3,000 feet off the ground, did your heart start to pound like mine did? And I think it pounds because we can relate. Now, I don't mean relate in that you're ever going to go do that. I just mean relate in that we, in our lives, certainly feel that. You know, fear is a part of everyone's life, but one of the greatest tricks that fear plays on us is leading us to believe that we are the only one who feels it. As soon as you Google quotes on fear, though, you realize that you're not alone. There are a ton of quotes on fear. And so I did this the other day. I put into Google and hit search, and everyone from Mark Twain to Winston Churchill to William Wallace to Bilbo Baggins has a quote about fear. And maybe the most famous one is this: the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. That was FDR during the Great Depression. You know, what do I want to accomplish this morning is this. I want to answer these 2 questions. 1, what does fear look like in your life? And number 2, is that fear going to mark the end of the road for a dream or a goal that you have in your life? Or is it going to mark the beginning to a greater thing that God can do? In order to unpack that a little bit, I want to go to Mark chapter 4. This is an incredible passage that Mark tells us about this time when the disciples were in a boat on the Sea of Galilee, and something happens to them. Something powerful, something frightening. And I believe that Jesus' reaction to the disciples is one of the best teachings that we could ever unpack on how to deal with our fears. So let's jump in. It's Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41. It says this: "That day when evening came, he, Jesus, said to his disciples, 'Let us go to the other side.' Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were other boats with them. But then a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, 'Teacher, don't you care if we drown?' He got up. He rebuked the wind and said to the waves, 'Quiet, be still.' Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, 'Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?' They were terrified, and they asked each other, 'Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him.' Do you feel that emotion in that passage? Did you feel the moment when the hope was kind of just getting like sucked right out of the boat and fear was beginning to replace it? I could relate to that. I feel like I've been there before. Because 22 years ago, for the first time in my life, I stood up in front of a group of people to give just a small little 15-minute talk. No big deal, right? It was a huge deal. I was petrified. I didn't think anything could be more scary and more painful than public speaking for the first time. But then I found out 2 weeks later that there was something more scary and more painful than public speaking for the first time. It was public speaking for the second time. Because what happens the second time is that you have this few days in front of it to realize that you're going to have to face your fear again. I went on like this for about 3 months until I finally had to come to terms with this truth that I had a paralyzing fear of speaking in front of people. And for me, this fear was particularly problematic because, you see, I had felt like God was putting a calling on my life to go into ministry where I would have opportunities to get in front of and speak to people. It wasn't one of those fears I could just say, I'll just never do that again. It got so bad, in fact, on the days that I would have to get up and give a talk, I wouldn't be able to eat anything. An hour before I would get up, the room would start spinning. I would start sweating. It was absolutely miserable. But the only option I felt like I had was just to do it and plow through it and just do it enough that I just get used to it. Suck it up, so to speak. Well, 4 years of plowing through and for the first time speaking in front of people started to get a little more easier. I was starting to get a little more comfortable with this. And I thought to myself, well, this is good. Here's the lesson. If you just plow through the fear, then you can overcome it and it'll go away. Right? 3 years in, I'm standing on a stage, giving a regular Sunday morning message in front of the same group of students that I've been giving it to for years. And this fear comes out of nowhere like a squall off the Sea of Galilee, and it absolutely seizes me. The room starts spinning. I start sweating. I don't know what's happening. My notes are going blurry, and I start to fumble around for a chair that I need to sit on. And finally, I find one, and I get on there, and I sit down, and I take a deep, long, hard, painful breath. Because I knew that this was a moment when a very real decision in my life was going to need to be made. Because this fear was not something that was going to be able to simply be plowed through or gotten used to. I needed to decide whether this fear of mine was going to be the end of the road or just a beginning of a much bigger journey. So my question for you is, what do you fear? As I describe this, maybe you'd say, well, speaking in front of people, I fear that. Maybe it's failure for you. Kat and Jesus, when they were up here kind of dramatizing this idea of fear, maybe you thought of a few things. Failure, injury, pain, death, disapproval, being rejected by others, financial insecurity, change, taking chances, risk, being judged, not measuring up. The list goes on. We said this at the very beginning, but it's worth saying again, is that the trick that fear pulls on us is making us believe that we are the only ones who experience it. But the truth is that if you are a normal person, you experience fear in your life at some point. But here's the good news. Number one, God knows that, and He's got a plan. And the plan is, according to Mark chapter 4, what we just read, is that when we are most afraid, Jesus naps. I mean, unless mine was wrong, did you get that too in there? Was that up on the screen? be honest for a second. Have you ever felt like Jesus was taking a nap when you needed him the most? I felt that way. You wouldn't be alone. His own friends, the disciples, felt that. We just read about that. And they felt that way because he was actually taking a nap. But like so often is the case with Scripture, there is something actually bigger going on in this passage that God is doing behind these words. And so Jesus in this passage is very intentionally showing these disciples and us that there are three key ways to address our fears. Number one, change the question. Number two, embrace the storm. And number three, always remember to leave the shore with the captain in the boat. Number one, he tells us to change the question. So while Jesus was napping in the boat, the disciples fell for the oldest trick in the book. And I fall for that trick too. Maybe you do sometimes. That they allowed the scariest and the loudest thing to become the main thing. I could just imagine the squall comes up, the wind and the waves and the lightning was crashing, and their lives were being threatened. And they were intimidated by this because this was the scariest and loudest and most present and most immediate problem that they had. And I know what you're thinking right now because I'm kind of thinking it too. Yeah, their kind of panic seems reasonable to me. I mean, we've all seen these movies before, right? Where like there's the boat and it's out on the storm and the waves start crashing over and people start flying off and then masts crack because of lightning and they come down on people's heads and then pirates storm the ship and they start carrying people away. All right, not the pirate thing. It's not that big of a deal. They start to freak out a little bit in this increasingly tense situation. Do you know one of the dangerous effects of fear is that it can be extremely disorienting? In fact, studies show, if you look at the brain, that there's this chemical that's released when we're afraid of something, and it'll cause us to become disoriented and confused. And when disorientation combines with confusion, you start to get self-doubt, don't you? And so sometimes when we confront our fears, we can start to say things that are not true about us. Like, oh, I'm scared to do this, so I must not be good or smart enough to do it. I guess I'm just not worthy enough for this person. I'm not as pretty as she is, so I'm just not going to do that thing. Or I'm not as talented as he is. Fear is one of the chief contributors to self-doubt, which is in turn one of the chief contributors to quitting. And so as we read, the disciples' response to experiencing fear holds a lot of emotion and a lot of desperation when they ask this question. Teacher, don't you care if we drown? Have you asked Jesus that question before? Maybe you've asked it this year at some point. Maybe it's been in the last month or week. Maybe you even asked that question this morning. Sometime after I had the panic attack I described to you, I was really frustrated with God about this. And I remember sitting down in prayer and crying out these exact words, God, don't you care if I drown? Because my fear of public speaking and losing the life that I felt like God had led me to was the scariest and loudest thing in my life at that point. And so it became the main thing and dominated my thought pattern. I wonder if that happens to you. The thing is that fear tells us we are going to drown. But Jesus tells us that when we ask, will I drown? That we're asking the wrong question. Two of the primary ways that we can learn from a teacher or a mentor, Jesus was that in the case of the disciples, is number one, by asking great questions. And they kind of did that. Don't you care if we drown? It's a fair question at that point. But also, we learn from others by imitating their actions. Jim Cabral, who's a worship leader up at the Hampstead campus, and he comes down here sometimes and leads here at Westminster. After I gave this talk last week, he came up to me and he shared, he said, Jim, I am terrified of flying. But I've learned this trick is that when I encounter turbulence and I'm white knuckling it on the handrest there, that I just look over to the flight attendants, and if they're still serving cocktails to happy customers, then we are going to be A-okay. If they're panicking and buckling, then the end is near. But Jesus is on the same boat. He's being pelted by the same waves, feeling the same wind as the disciples. He's just as human as they are, yet his reaction to the storm was completely different. They were panicked. He slept. How is that possible? Jesus had changed the question. So the question is no longer, will I drown? And he introduces a new one. So he wakes up, he probably stretches and yawns from a good nap. He probably had a good nap, does a few chunk rotations, turns to the wind and the waves and says, quiet, be still. And they were. Then he pivots to his disciples. And he asks them a different question. He said, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? I want to look at those two questions in order. I'm going to start with looking at the question, why are you so afraid? When we kind of glance over this sometimes when we read Mark, we think this is a rhetorical question or just a general question, like a generally speaking, what are you afraid? I think Jesus is asking his disciples to get really, really specific. I after a few weeks after the panic attack, I went to see a therapist who I trusted, and I was like, hey man, I need some help here. I need some answers. And you will never believe, I sat down with him and he looked at me. You'll never believe what question he asked me. He said, Jim, what are you so afraid of? And I said, well, if I'm being honest, I'm a little afraid of fainting on stage. And so he says, well, what would be so bad about that? I was like, it would be like mortifying. I would be completely embarrassed about this. And he said, oh, okay, what's so bad about that? I was like, what do you mean what's so bad about that? People would view me as a failure, that I couldn't give a good talk. He said, what's wrong with that? I said, what, are you kidding me? And then so finally I said, here's the deal. If this happened to me, then people wouldn't like me anymore. And he said, now we're getting somewhere. You see, it's an incredible question to ask yourself when you face fears. Because if you are honest in the process, it begins to reveal the deeper truths of your heart, which is the stuff that Jesus is most interested in, isn't it? What's really going on in your heart and in your mind. So Jesus asks a second question, sort of a follow-up. He says, do you still have no faith? And you're like, hold on a second, Jesus. You are turning this like perilous, storm, fearful situation into a question about faith? Yep. Do you know how it was that Jesus slept in the middle of that storm? He had absolutely no doubt in his mind the truthfulness of what God said in Isaiah 41:10 when he said, do not fear. For I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, and I will help you, and I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Jesus knew that without a shadow of a doubt. And he was able to answer that because by taking a nap, he was changing the question. And he was demonstrating a posture of trust that whatever happens to this boat, and it could get really, really bad, and in your lives, your fear or whatever it is you're facing can get really, really bad. But Jesus knew that when his eyes were closed to the storm and open to God, that he would be able to say without a shadow of doubt that God says, do not fear. I know he's with me. before you and I can even begin to understand that kind of trust, we need to change the question in our lives from will I drown to will I trust? My son Andrew, who's 7 now, this is about 3 years ago, so he was 4, and he loved swimming, but he's a little fearful of the water, and really still is, and he wears this cute little floaty and his goggles and the whole deal, and other kids were going off the diving board, and so Andrew wanted to go off the diving board too, and so he gets up there and he gets out to the edge of the diving board. I'm getting in the water because I'm going to, catch him, and so I say, Andrew, go ahead and jump. But I notice the wheels kind of turning in Andrew's head, and I think the question that Andrew was asking himself was, am I going to drown? You and I ask that question all the time, don't we? When we face our fears, when we face big things in our lives. If I do this, am I going to drown? Are the costs too great? Are the stakes too high? The truth is that Andrew, standing on that diving board, is never going to change his mind to that question, will I drown? He's just not ever going to get there, and neither will you, and neither will I. What he needed to do is change the question, and so as his dad, I said, hey, jump, you can trust me, buddy. And his first response was, I'm not so sure about that, Dad. And that's okay. But he was able, the more I said, you can trust me, buddy, he was able to understand, yeah, I can trust my dad. And he got to that point, and his no shifted to yes, and he jumped, and I dropped him. No, I'm kidding, I didn't drop him. That's step 1 in the midst of a scary storm. Change the question from will I drown to will I trust. Number 2 is this: embrace the storm. Jesus was napping in the boat for probably a lot of reasons, but here were 2. We just talked about one, that he was modeling faith and trust in God. But I think there was another reason that he was napping. I think it was because he knew the storm was coming and he wanted to test his disciples a little bit. Because Jesus knew that in the middle of the storm is the place where oftentimes we will meet God in the most amazing ways. And he wanted to give his disciples a chance to do it well. Because ordinarily, our natural response is to run from fear towards safety, isn't it? Yet what's plastered throughout the scriptures is the exact opposite. It's the opposite of that. The scriptures challenge us to live a life where we are taking risk, where we are experiencing God in the midst of our fears. Isaiah 41 says this: do not fear. It doesn't say, do not fear, run for your lives. It says, do not fear, for I am with you. John 10:10, the second part of it does not say, I have come that you might have a really, really, really safe, mundane, comfortable life. It says, I have come that you might have life and life abundant. Isaiah 43:2 says, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. And when you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. Do you read that and you're ever like, why aren't you airlifting me out to safety, God? He's with us when we encounter those things. And notice, it's not an if we encounter them. We spend so much time in our lives trying to avoid things that make us uncomfortable, like fears. He says, when you engage, we are all going to have our times when we need to engage in our fears. Psalm 23, the last one. You guys, many of you probably even have this psalm memorized maybe. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and staff, they comfort me. I mean, come on. Shouldn't the question be, God, what are we doing in the middle of the valley of the shadow of death? Seems like we shouldn't be here. But apparently that's the place where God meets us in some of the greatest ways. Because those are the places that we need him the most. In John 10:10, it says that the thief comes to steal and kill and destroy. Did you know that Satan's victory is not getting us to feel scared or feel the emotion of fear? His victory is in getting us to back down from doing something that we feel like we should be doing in our lives because we're afraid of facing our fear. Don't let the wind and the waves scare you. Let's dance in the rain a little bit and allow it to be a start to something greater rather than the end of the line. So 1, change the question. Number 2, embrace the storm. And lastly, always, always, always remember to leave the shore with the captain in your boat. You know, for all the questioning and panicking and fearing that the disciples did on that boat that day in Mark chapter 4, they nailed the most important thing. And that was they had the captain in the boat with them. That's Jesus, by the way. A few chapters later, in Mark, they're back out on the water. And Jesus doesn't sail out with them this time, but he does a different approach. And Jesus comes from the mountainside and he starts walking out on the water. Maybe you've heard of this story. Jesus walks on water. And in the account in the Gospel of Matthew, it says that Peter, who was in the boat with him, saw Jesus and said, "Hey, if it's you, Jesus, call me to come out on the water with you." And so Jesus said, "All right, Peter, come on, man." And so Peter steps out of the boat and he starts walking on water. And you'll never guess what happens. All of a sudden, wind and waves again. Like what? This is a theme here. Remember, it's not if, it's when. So the wind and the waves start stirring up, and Peter's walking on water. And so I know what Jesus is thinking. Well, I don't really know. My guess is that Jesus is thinking, all right, Peter, he got his chance to shine here. Is he going to remember to change the question? And is he going to remember that it's good to embrace the storm? Well, the wind and the waves kick up. And Matthew 14:30 says, when Peter saw the wind, he was afraid, and he began to sink. Oh, Peter. Oh, Jim. Oh, Kevin. Oh, Anna, Kristen. But then, Peter, he gets it right. Watch this. Right after that, the tail end of Matthew 14:30, it says that Peter, and I pray that I get this right, and I pray that we all get it right too. He cries out, "Lord, save me. Lord, save me." I can't stress to you enough that one of the most significant narratives in these gospel accounts is that it's not if, but when life gets scary. It's not if, but when we fail and we fear and we fall. It's in those times where the grace of God reaches out and grabs us and says, "Hey, I am with you." If Jesus is in your boat, if he is on the journey with you, then that becomes the main thing, not the scariest and loudest thing. He can become the main thing. So you might be able to fight through a fear without God in your life. I suppose it's possible. There might be ways to trick your brain and some sort of psychological stuff that you can do to process a scary situation differently. But I think that all you would have gained is overcoming a fear. A fear that may even come back at some point. I don't want to miss asking you this morning, if you're on your journey through life with the captain in the boat, because having the captain in the boat makes all the difference. You know, since my fear struck again a little over 10 years ago, I've given a lot of messages. And if I'm honest, I encounter this fear every single time I get up on this stage, walk up these stairs or in the back or at Hampstead or wherever it is. Every single time. But the thing is that this message is not a message on how to make your fears go away. This message this morning is about how to meet the living God in the midst of your fears. How to allow His grace to not only meet you in the middle of it, but to help you embark on a greater journey because of it. And so, this is what I do every time I get a chance to get up and speak. I pray that God would give me the words to speak and that He would be gracious enough to give me the strength to deliver them. And so the really cool thing about being up here in front of you this morning is that it is a thrill and it is scary and it is fulfilling all at the same time. It is an adventure with God, and there's no place that I would rather be. And it's my prayer that you could say the same thing when your fear strikes you. Maybe you're in this room and you've realized that your fear this morning is something that has paralyzed you. And there's areas in your life which you are not able to move forward in because of this fear. My prayer is that today might be the day that you look fear in the eye, you cling to God in the middle of it, and you say, the captain's in my boat, so what have I got to lose? Let's buckle up and let's rock and roll with this thing. We're going to spend our last 5 minutes together. The band's going to come back up and we're going to sing a song called Fear is a Liar. And just stay in your seats, and they're going to do it, and allow these words to just minister to you, resonate with you a little bit this morning. And as you do, take these few minutes to ask the questions that we started off with. What does fear look like in your life? And are you going to let that be the end of the line? Or is it possible that it could be just the beginning to something much greater?